It's my honest assessment that Nelson Peltz has been behind all of the changes at Disney. And at this time, he was doing this to support a friend, Ike Perlmutter, who knew that Disney could be something that it wasn't yet being. And I believe that while Nelson Peltz is not seeking any type of proxy fight, he is already getting what he wants without pursuing a proxy fight. And that Bob Iger is a broken man who is doing what essentially Nelson Peltz is telling him to do. This is Adam Post, publisher of more than 1,000 comic books, and I have been covering Disney and all of the goings on at Disney for some time over the last few months. And I do believe that from everything I've read and everything that's been said, that Nelson Peltz is not done with his work at Disney. And I want to get into it in more detail. So Nelson Peltz did say that he's satisfied with Bob Iger agreeing to make all the changes he was making, with 7,000 layoffs and, of course, the consolidation of a bunch of their divisions. This is essentially what Nelson Peltz said he wanted. But what's also interesting is it's the same thing that Dan Loeb wanted. Dan Loeb invested $1 billion in Disney stock. That's funny. Same as Nelson Peltz. Nelson Peltz did $900 million. Isn't that a coincidence? He also wanted layoffs. This goes back 5 months. I did this video talking about Dan Loeb from Third Point Capital. Dan Loeb apparently wanted exactly the same thing that Nelson Peltz did. So Nelson Peltz somehow was coordinating with Dan Loeb. I mean, realistically, that was in September, that Dan Loeb was saying this. And apparently in July is when Nelson Peltz was working this. So of course these people are going to pick up the phone. They're not in competition. They're trying to do the same thing and trying to get the price of Disney stock up. Peltz had a relationship with Ike Perlmutter where he was trying to help Ike as well on top of all of this. But the godfather of all this is Nelson Peltz. It's not Dan Loeb, and no disrespect to this self-made billionaire Dan Loeb, but Nelson Peltz has been doing this for decades, ever since he was in the book in the 1980s, The Predator's Ball. This is actually a great book. You see people in handcuffs or whatnot. This goes to the story of Mike Milken's junk bond raiders from Drexel Burnham. They were actually brilliant finance people, and I've been following this really since the late 1980s, believe it or not. I've always been deeply interested in finance. I was on the board of a small public company. I have a little background in finance that way, but I will tell you Nelson Peltz is covered in that book, so I'm familiar with him from, a couple of decades. This is Nelson Peltz's game. He's the godfather here. So what should we expect? Well, I have seen a lot of people commenting on videos I've done before. A lot of the comments are, okay, great. Nelson Peltz apparently has won. He seems like he's happy, but he's not changing the content. It's going to still be woke. It's going to be inclusive. And the answer to that question is yes. Right now it is going to be inclusive. There isn't going to be any changes to the woke content. But a couple things about that. The first thing is, if you're thinking like a businessman and you're going and you're saying, okay, look, we want to see financial improvement. The first thing you're going to do when you're going to make financial improvements is you're going to assess what's going on with the business, and you're going to say, while yes, the franchises are very important, and it's important not to put ideology in front of story, and we know that that's been happening with Star Wars, it's been happening with Pixar, it's been happening with Marvel, but that's not really quantifiable. It's a good argument. I agree with the argument, but it's not quantifiable in terms of board of directors and in terms of the stockholders. However, what is quantifiable is the basic business structure of Disney, which was absolutely ridiculous. It was not being managed well. Now, this even is, again, it's before you start to look at but the content is woke and you've kind of ruined Star Wars. We're not even talking about that. We're talking about 7,000 people that Bob Iger has agreed to lay off and has announced that they are going to lay off. These are people. How do you find 7,000 people that don't really belong at the company? They had a whole metaverse division. They had all these people at Disney Media Entertainment Distribution that didn't belong there. All kinds of thousands of people that really had no business being at the company in the first place. This was found by the consultancy company. We heard from Bob Chapek that they hired McKinsey & Company, which is a consultancy that's been around for decades, and they come into companies, they provide all sorts of consulting and all sorts of advice on management strategy, of course, layoffs as well. Of course, Nelson Peltz in his previous adventures, because he's done this more than 30 times before with other public companies. He's an old man. He's been doing this a long time. Of course Nelson Peltz was involved with those consultants. Exactly how? I don't know. I'm here on YouTube, okay? I'm not in Nelson Peltz's organization. I don't work at the highest levels of Disney. I'm just telling you from a common sense standpoint, we recently heard reported that people were interviewing for their jobs at Disney Media Entertainment Distribution. People inside of Disney. Were they interviewing with Bob Iger? Of course not. They're interviewing most likely with consultants, not people from human resources, outside people from McKinsey and Company who were talking to Disney employees and planning out how they were going to do the employee reductions and all these massive layoffs. This all comes down to Nelson Peltz coordinating this entire layoff. And if you look at CNBC and you look at the recent interview that Bob Iger did with CNBC, he talks about the changes at the company. He sounds like a broken man. You can compare his current interview with any interviews he's done in the past, and you will see he just kind of looks like a broken manager. Someone who is not going up against Nelson Peltz. If you remember about, a few weeks ago, a month ago, he was a big talker. Bob Iger was a big man. All of the board talking about, oh, Nelson Peltz, he can't add anything. He knows nothing about entertainment. Notice they stopped talking about that. They realized they're not going to go up against Nelson Peltz because it makes no sense to go up against Nelson Peltz because Nelson Peltz already has the game completely figured out. My expectation is this. Nelson Peltz effectuates the correct consolidation of the business units, the correct layoffs, and then the next move is to address what's happened to the franchises. Keep in mind, and we heard nothing about this, Nelson Peltz very publicly said, the flywheel is broken at Disney. You need to fix the flywheel. Now, if you're not familiar with current business management trends, you may not be familiar with what he was talking about with regards to a flywheel. But note that Bob Iger did not talk about the flywheel and restoring the flywheel. That hasn't been addressed. That will be addressed next. Peltz is not done. This is what a flywheel is. If you're familiar with the book, and you might not be, Good to Great by Jim Collins, Jim Collins wrote a great series of business books talking about what makes companies great. I think a good 5 books that are really, really good, and I highly recommend them if you're business people. But this is where Jim Collins introduced into the lexicon of business people the concept of a flywheel. This is a good book, Turning the Flywheel, a monograph to accompanying good to great companies. And let me explain what a business flywheel actually is. What the flywheel effect is on business and how it can grow your business. The flywheel effect happens when small wins for your business build on each other over time and eventually gain so much momentum that growth almost seems to happen by itself, similar to the momentum created by a flywheel on a rowing machine. It's a fascinating concept. It does apply to all businesses. It's almost like if you have a restaurant in your neighborhood, it's when a restaurant becomes hot. Everybody wants to go there. It's when Disney did The Little Mermaid. Everybody was excited about The Little Mermaid. It's when Disney's Marvel did The Avengers. And everybody was psyched to see The Avengers. People going berserk to see The Avengers. And it made an incredible amount of money. It was tremendously profitable. And of course that drove licensing. And of course that drove opportunities for more Marvel movies, merchandise, all sorts of financial success. And it was obvious that Marvel was a hot franchise. And back in the day, Disney was a hot franchise. Star Wars was a hot franchise. Those franchises aren't hot anymore. This is something that is going to be addressed. And keep in mind, when Nelson Peltz spends $900 million on stock, when Dan Loeb spends $1 billion on stock, when Ike Perlmutter, who was the guy who gave Marvel to Disney and trusted Disney with his asset, trusted Disney with a multi-billion-dollar asset. When he did that, he expected that flywheel to continue. And it's going to be addressed. It's not the first thing they're addressing, but it's going to be addressed as the second thing they're addressing. And I do recommend to go to CNBC, go to YouTube, just put Bob Iger interview CNBC. You're going to see the interview. You're going to understand, okay, Bob Iger doesn't seem like a tough guy. And look at Bob Iger's interviews to when he left Disney. And you'll see he was a lot more confident, a lot more commanding, a lot more in control. Right now, he's managing someone else's business. That's how he comes off. I want to get into this article. Before we do, please be sure you are subscribed to the channel. Click the bell for notifications. Give me a thumbs up. This is coming from Puck. Disney's everything on the table era begins. The inside conversation about Iger's gangbusters fourth quarter, the Peltz detente, the Hulu question, and more. This is an interesting interview between
Matt Belloni and a friend of his who's an investment banker. The investment banker sets Matt Belloni pretty well straight. Matt's got a great website. I really like following him. I follow him on Twitter as well. His content is good. But Matt has not done his homework on Nelson Peltz. He hasn't seen Nelson's history. He doesn't understand what Nelson is capable of. And the investment banker kind of sets him straight. This is from Matt. I've rarely been accused of drinking the Disney Kool-Aid, but the much anticipated earnings reveal yesterday seemed to hit all the right notes that Iger needed to hit. You know what's funny? Like, the notes got all hit, what needed to be hit. Do you think that Iger really sat down and just coincidentally he was doing all the things that Nelson Peltz wanted him to do? Was that a coincidence? Put in the comments below. Do you really believe that was a coincidence? Or do you believe there was some understanding or coordination of like, listen, all right, what do you want, Peltz? Just freaking tell me. I'm an old man at this point. Bill, the investment banker. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. It's probably safe to say that much of what Iger reported for the fourth quarter of 2022 was already in the bag by the time of his November return, but I do give him credit for conceiving a reorganization that puts the creatives back in the driver's seat. The creatives back in the driver's seat, and I've seen comments on videos, this only means that instead of Kareem Daniel, one guy with basically no entertainment experience, making all the decisions on how content should be distributed, either as films and how it should be promoted. That was ridiculous. That was something Bob Chapek did. It was absolutely ridiculous. The return to the control of the creatives is not even from a content standpoint. It's just from a standpoint of how are we going to market and promote this? And if you're going to hire talent onto your projects, you need to be able to tell them if it's going to be in theaters or not. I mean, that was just what Chapek did with that. Whether it was well-intentioned, whatever he was trying to do was ridiculous. You can't do that. Okay, Matt Belloni says, all of it. The analysts who demanded major cost cuts got 7,000 layoffs and $5.5 billion in planned reductions, including a $3 billion in content shrinkage. The streaming loss narrowed to just $1 billion for the quarter, which is still, they've lost now $12 billion on their streaming service, with Iger recommending to profitability there by 2024. The creatives got an endorsement with Iger uniting film, TV, and streaming in one entertainment unit and declaring Disney will return to creativity in the center of the company, even if it makes fewer shows and movies. And by December, investor Nelson Peltz will get his cherished dividend, the first since the pandemic. The stock is down a little more than 1% today, but up 24% for the year. Bank of America analyst Jessica Reif-Ehrlich said it was a decisive action, which is what Iger needed to convey, and Peltz wisely backed off, quote, his dumb crusade for a board seat. And this is where the investment banker straightens out Matt Belloni. I would just remind your Hollywood readers, Matt, that Peltz has a way of getting what he wants even if he loses a proxy fight, as he did when he went after Dupont, or if he never even engages in a proxy fight, as occurred with GE. A little bit of education from Matt Belloni, no disrespect to Matt. However, Peltz gets what he wants. Matt says, well, he kind of did win here. Trian's Disney stock is up 10.5% since January 12th when Peltz went public with the fight, and you could argue that Disney leaned into the cost-cutting and dividend thanks to the pressure, though I think cuts were already happening. Peltz should be happy, maybe treat his buddy instigator Ike Perlmutter to a peppermint frosty at the Wendy's in Palm Beach. I would urge our friend Iger to not get too complacent with a quiescent Peltz. Quiescent means a state or period of inactivity or dormancy. The crocodile is still there, just below the surface, watching, as he said today. Remember, at Dupont and GE, Peltz and Trian were catalysts for existential changes. At Dupont, I can see Peltz's fingerprints all over the replacement of longtime CEO Ellen Kullman with Ed Breen, a Peltz favorite and Dupont board member who happened to be available after Kullman unexpectedly, quote, resigned. And Trian ran the same playbook at GE, but without resorting to a proxy fight. It bought some $2.5 billion of GE stock and then proceeded to bare its teeth in the replacement of Jeff Immelt with John Flannery as CEO in 2017. Then, after 15 months, Trian led the coup that replaced Flannery with Larry Culp, a Peltz favorite who happened to be hanging out on the GE board. You take Peltz a lot more seriously than I do. The link between Nelson and his pal Perlmutter has been the most interesting to me because insiders at Disney know how vengeful Ike is, and how Ike went public today about being marginalized at Marvel after he tried to fire Kevin Feige, perhaps the most important Disney creative executive since Walt. Ike was not happy about it, Iger told CNBC. On Kevin Feige, great for Kevin Feige that he was a producer there at the right time, and he obviously did a serviceable job, which is to say, at least an adequate job early on when he was getting guidance from Stan Lee and other people who really understood Marvel. But it was Ike who was the most important executive at Marvel, because there'd be no Marvel if it wasn't for Ike. Ike didn't start Marvel, but Ike did save Marvel, and then he did transition it to Disney and trusted Disney, who betrayed him. And I think that unhappiness exists today. And you know what the link is between that and Nelson, his relationship? I think that's something you can speculate about. I won't. That's Iger's pushing a sharp dagger into Ike on CNBC. Fantastic television, yeah. I don't know why Matt Belloni doesn't like Ike Perlmutter. Ike Perlmutter is Marvel. There'd be no Marvel without Ike Perlmutter because it was going bankrupt and it was getting dissolved. There'd be no Phase 1 if it wasn't for Ike Perlmutter. It wasn't easy to save Marvel from bankruptcy. From Bill. Matt, I'm a little light on my Ike Perlmutter resume. Why do he and Iger hate each other so much? There's a whole backstory that doesn't really get reported. Perlmutter sold Marvel to Disney in 2009, and in that deal, they had a good relationship. Ike was kind of in awe of Iger, but Ike was also really difficult, screaming at many Disney executives and calling Iger at all hours with random suggestions. First ballot, a-hole Hall of Fame stuff. And then Ike sided with Alan Fine, who was running Marvel's creative committee in New York when Fine didn't want to make Black Panther and Captain Marvel and diversify the Marvel slate as Iger wanted. Ultimately, they announced those movies, but then Ike didn't want to budget them. It was a real problem, and Feige was becoming miserable under Ike's thumb. Finally, Kevin went to Alan Horn, Alan Bergman, at the studio, and then Iger got involved, and he smartly sided with Feige and put Marvel film under the studio, not Perlmutter, so Ike was pissed. Then in 2019, Iger took Marvel TV out from under Perlmutter, and he was even more pissed. Cut to last year when his buddy Peltz emerges. Nothing like a peeved billionaire who can't get his way. No wonder Ike was angry and teamed up with Nelson, a billionaire who does know how to get his way. From Matt, the big headline for me is Iger's willingness to sell Hulu, saying everything is on the table. It's not a huge surprise. I reported Sunday that Disney was working with Goldman Sachs to figure out whether it made more sense to offload the asset than to spend $9 billion to buy out Comcast 33% in 2024 or sooner. You know, Goldman Sachs is there to assess a value to Hulu. They're not there to make only advice on whether or not they should sell it. Matt Belloni is a great writer. I really like his content. He just doesn't have any finance background. But Iger is also cooling on the adult, non-branded programming that has powered Hulu. Quote, I'm concerned about the undifferentiated general entertainment, particularly in the competitive landscape that we're operating in. He told CNBC's Rich Greenfield, the analyst thinks Iger will try to sell Hulu because it's not differentiated enough from Netflix, Amazon, HBO Max, and Apple TV Plus. I'm now inclined to agree. This is all coming as Disney Plus did not lose a ton of subscribers despite a 40% price increase in the US for the ad-free tier. If you exclude losses from Hotstar in India, Disney Plus actually added subs this quarter, so maybe Iger thinks he can suck all the content from Hulu to Disney Plus, raise the prices again, and sell the Hulu pipes to Comcast or whomever. What do you suppose Iger is thinking in streaming? And I'll say this is, the main concern is the reason they spent so much money on Fox was to get scale when they bought Fox for $71 billion, less $24 billion in other spin-offs that they sold. They didn't spend $71 billion on Fox. They spent $71 billion, less $24 billion in content that they sold off. Sports leagues, as well as a percentage of ownership of a company called Sky. However, it is also important to keep Comcast from having a viable streaming service because Comcast is a major competitor of theirs. So I don't see them selling Hulu so easily. But what you do see is Iger is going to do whatever Nelson Peltz tells him the F to do. That is what Iger is going to do. He has no fight left in it. From Bill, look, Matt, there's a limit, which we're fast approaching, to how much money people are willing to spend on streaming services. If Iger thinks he can raise prices further on Disney Plus, God bless him. Prices are going up for Netflix, Hulu, Paramount Plus, the whole lot of them. My bet is that the consumer is going to say basta, which means enough in Italian, and will pick and choose. It's likely that Disney Plus and Netflix will survive the shakeout with perhaps a twist of Hulu, depending on whether it ends up at Disney, Comcast, or they jointly decide to put Hulu out to bid. Although I have no idea who is out there hoping to get deeper into the streaming wars. I'm sure Amazon has enough with Prime and MGM. Paramount and Hulu, NFW, which means no effing way. I support Disney will end up keeping Hulu and folding it into the Disney bundle, forcing adults without children to make some hard choices. I agree with that. I don't see Disney selling Hulu. Maybe they would get $20 billion from Comcast. They can give Comcast $10 billion. It's not that big a deal. From Matt, yeah, although this could just be Iger trying to drum up bidders, or maybe he wants Comcast to think he's willing to walk away from a deal, Iger didn't offer a lot of intel on further M&A plans, except saying ESPN isn't for sale, which probably nobody seems to believe. Siloing ESPN in its own unit certainly makes it easier to sell a spin-off. And we covered this in a video yesterday. Of course, it makes it easier to sell ESPN if it's its own separate thing, the way that Disney has now restructured it to be. Who knows what kind of head fakes Iger is engaging in with ESPN and Hulu, but I still really like the idea of swapping Disney's 80% stake for ESPN and Comcast's 30% stake of Hulu. Okay, this is nuts. There is no swapping out, and Bill sounds like a great investment banker, but there is no way they're going to swap out ESPN for a stake in Hulu. ESPN is the lifeblood of their cable distribution. They will sell ESPN if ESPN no longer supports the distribution of their linear channels, their cable channels. But currently, they have no cable channel business whatsoever if Disney doesn't control ownership of ESPN. From Matt, you're so confident. One investor suggested that Iger backing away from General Entertainment is an implicit admission that Disney's $71 billion acquisition of Fox, which again was not a $71 billion acquisition because they had $24 billion in spinoffs before the deal even closed. So it was really like 71 minus 24. Everyone is pulling back on content spend right now, so Disney naturally is focusing on core offering. And Matt does think if Disney hopes to compete with Netflix globally, the general interest stuff must remain some part of that. If I'm Ted Sarandos or Greg Peters at Netflix, these are top guys at Netflix, I'm praying Iger decides to keep his content offering at the kiddie table. What's your take on the revisionist wisdom of the Fox deal? Bill agrees with Peltz that Iger ended up overpaying for Fox. That was kind of unavoidable because basically, and I'm a critic of Iger, obviously. Iger didn't have much of a choice. They didn't have Disney Plus. Hulu really was a viable streaming service. They were going to at least get control of Hulu. For $71 billion, less $24 billion, Fox was a tough decision to make, but it was something they kind of had to do. So you can't really blame them for that. Also from Bill, I would agree that a Disney insider has the best chance of succeeding Iger, but you know something? Not necessarily. I think now it's become more and more clear that Peltz is actually still involved with Disney's board. He's communicating with someone. He's coordinating with Dan Loeb. Dan Loeb spent $1 billion. He got one guy on the Disney board, and then Dan Loeb shut up. Well, obviously Dan Loeb shut up so that Nelson Peltz could take center stage. And obviously Nelson Peltz did take center stage. He got things done, and Dan Loeb didn't have to do anything but sit back. Now, if we hear that Nelson Peltz has sold his stake, if we hear that Dan Loeb has sold his stake, then we understand, okay, these guys are no longer involved. But in the meantime, each of these guys have $1 billion or so invested in Disney, and Nelson Peltz's friend has a couple of $1 billion invested in Disney. They're not walking away from Disney, and they're not letting Bob Iger do whatever he wants without being criticized. So keep an eye on Disney, keep an eye on Peltz, keep an eye on people saying, oh, Nelson Peltz has sold all of his stock from Disney. If that happens, you'll hear about it publicly. It's not going to be a big secret. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments below. Do you also see what I see, that Peltz is not quite done with the company yet? Always love to see your comments. Please be sure to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell for notifications. Give me a thumbs up. And I'll see you again soon with another video. And if I don't see you, I will miss you.